We now have the privilege of hearing from Jordan Kearns, who is with the Foundation for Resilient Societies, and they have been doing some research into the cost of hardening our grid and protecting our grid. So I'm sure this is going to be very interesting. We look forward to it. Jordan.
Good morning. As Mary said, my name is Jordan Kearns. I'm with the Foundation for Resilient Societies. So as Mary said, I've been working on a project with the Foundation for Resilient Societies on the cost of protecting the bulk electric power system from an EMP attack. Right now, we're in the very early stages of this project, so this talk today, I'm mostly going to go through our methodology, the beginnings of a case study that we're doing to get that started, and hopefully we can solicit some feedback from you. I'll be around for the rest of the day, so I'd be happy if you could grab me if we're doing something wrong. We'd be happy to hear from it at the early parts of the project. So first, in setting out, trying to determine how much it will cost to protect the bulk power system from an electromagnetic pulse, the first question you have to answer is, how do we define protection? So the first objective we have is, what is EMP resilience? What does it look like? And I found myself, as I was trying to answer this question, thinking about, as I'm sure many of you were, the events in Puerto Rico and the devastation there to the critical infrastructure that we've seen. So I just have a few pictures that I think draw a nice distinction between thinking about EMP resilience and how resilience has worked with the Puerto Rico events. So the main point I want to draw in is that everything in Puerto Rico has been imported. You have fuel that has had to be imported from outside the island. People are lining up for that to be distributed here and here. Same thing, this are external generators being brought in from the Coast Guard. Similarly, medical supplies and medical treatment. This is the USS Comfort, sent from the mainland U.S. to help provide medical relief to the Puerto Rican island. Same thing, this is food being distributed. These are bags of rice brought in again from the mainland to the Puerto Rican island. Same thing, of course, with water, one of the most important. And beyond the resources necessary for sustaining everyday life, the expertise and equipment necessary to repair the critical infrastructure also had to be imported from the rest of the mainland. So in thinking about EMP resilience, we really have a real distinction between the events in Puerto Rico, and that is, as devastating as the effects in Puerto Rico are, the effects were fairly concentrated, and the ratio of affected to unaffected areas in the United States was quite low, and Puerto Rico could rely tremendously on external aid and assistance from the rest of the American country. With EMP, given the wide area effects that we're dealing with, that ratio of affected to unaffected regions might be much higher, and a resiliency strategy dependent on large amounts of external assistance might not be possible. This means that we need to have resiliency within our infrastructure that would allow rapid restoration based on local resources as opposed to heavy reliance on external aid. So we came up, or I came up with this sort of working definition of resilience for the cost estimation study. We want to estimate the cost required to ensure timely restoration of the bulk power system sufficient to support regional critical infrastructure following an EMP attack. Secondary objective we have in this project is to develop sort of a general framework for looking at the bulk power system and other resiliency measures, and hopefully we can generalize this framework to protect against other sorts of threats that might have a different vector than EMP. So in scoping out the project, we might want to start with a top-down look at what it would cost to protect the power grid. And by top-down, you really start from the top down. So this is a very rough way of doing things, but a good way to get a handle on the size of the problem we might be looking at. So for top-down, you can start off with just a few assumptions, sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation very quickly, and say, we know the U.S. power system is about $2 trillion worth of assets. We add about $100 billion worth of assets a year to that. From consultation with experts such as Dr. Baker here, we can apply some general rules of thumb, such as retrofitting an asset, at a very high level might cost about 25% of that asset's capital cost to protect for EMP. It's a lot cheaper if you do it new build. It's about 5% of the construction cost. And we can apply these rules of thumb, say we want to protect the U.S. electric grid over 10 years, come up with about $550 billion or $55 billion a year over 10 years, and you can divide that out over the U.S. population. You come to a very crude number of about $172 per resident here per year over 10 years. That's a high number. That's maybe a useful starting point for debate. But the disadvantage with top-down methods, well, the advantage of top-down methods is that it's very quick. I just walked you through that in about 30 seconds. The disadvantage is it's probably going to be an overestimate. You're not leaving anything out since you're starting from the top, but you're probably counting a lot of things and counting them very crudely that aren't necessarily necessary for sustaining, say, a minimum level of societal functioning and really what we need to protect. I mean, no one's going to be too upset if this projector doesn't have sufficient generation to meet this load during an EMP event. Really what we're talking about is meeting critical infrastructure and minimum societal functioning. So that leads us to what we're doing in this study, which is a bottom-up engineering-based study where we're going through and looking at what would it take to connect key generators, key black start generators to key pieces of load and get this minimum level of societal functioning within each sort of regional unit. Break it down broadly into 3 steps. Again, we're at the early stages, so for this presentation, I'm mostly going to focus on step 1 since that's still where we are. The first step, this is also probably the most challenging step, is to identify the most important links in that electricity supply chain within each region sufficient to support that critical infrastructure. The second is once we've identified each of those links, we'll go through and estimate the unit cost of protection for various classes of these assets. And then we'll go through, multiply the units by the unit cost and then add everything up and we'll have our aggregated total. So again, starting with step 1, identifying the most important links. This is a little infographic of the electricity supply chain. Essentially, you have fuel supply being brought in by, this is rail is the image I use here, or natural gas pipelines. But that supply is an important part of the supply chain, of course. The fuel is brought to the generators, combusted or somehow converted into electrical energy. This then goes through a step-up transformer to the transmission system, goes through the transmission system, and then through a number of step-down transformers is eventually brought down to the sub-transmission or distribution level, where it then goes to load. Now, this linear process, there's a lot of moving parts that all have to be coordinated. So if you know anything about the electricity system, there's not a lot of buffers, not a lot of storage right now. Electricity supply and demand have to be matched in real time. So all of this is a very complicated balancing act to keep the grid running. So in addition to this sort of linear, maybe intuitive supply chain, we have communications and control, which are also very important for ensuring that the grid is able to continue operating. So you have a central control room that governs generator dispatch, governs the transmission, to a lesser extent the distribution and load. Load is increasing through things such as demand response. During black start operations, you might have coordination between generators and load to ensure that there's load matched to the generators as they come on. Again, supply and demand have to be in continual balance for the grid to continue operating. Now, for the sake of this study, I've sort of drawn a box around the scope that we're focusing on. And you see we're leaving out 2 pieces. We're not considering the cost of hardening the various load that's a bit beyond our expertise in the scope of the project. And we're also not considering the fuel supply. That's also would greatly not only increase the complexity of the project, but it's also being handled through other means. You might be familiar with the DOE-initiated Notice of Proposed Rulemaking and FERC right now, explicitly looking at methods of compensating generators that keep fuel on site to avoid this sort of problem for extended periods of time. We should have at least a preliminary decision on how FERC will rule on that in about 10 days. Right now, for the sake of this project, we're looking at transmission, distribution, communication, and control hardening. The key tool that we're building to identify these links is a bulk power system database. And this is just essentially to impress you in terms of the scope of what we're looking at. This is a very big problem, or big problem to solve. We have 111 balancing authorities charged with balancing electricity supply and demand throughout the United States. Over 1,000 electric utilities that these have to communicate with. These electric utilities then have to respond to their generators and their transmission assets, about 5,000 large generators, and you're looking at about 55,000 substations. So these are a lot of assets. Again, not all of these need to be protected, but to know which ones you need to protect and which ones you don't need to protect, you need a database that has all of these and establishes the links between them, and then the links of these assets to your critical infrastructure. So to begin looking at this again, that's that last slide. You really see it's a big problem. We're starting small with a case study looking at the Charlotte metropolitan statistical area, and also York County is a subset of that. So this is the Charlotte metropolitan statistical area. You can see, I'm going to walk away from the mic for just 1 second. You can see this this circle right here is Charlotte. You have the North Carolina, South Carolina line. These counties make up the metropolitan statistical area. That's a census division, a way of looking at things. And I've gone through publicly accessible databases, started building our bulk power system database, and have identified major power plants as well as key sources of critical infrastructure that are going to be your load. So you see these yellow lightning bolts, there are about 10 of them. These are large infrastructures. You have about 2 nuclear plants, 2 large nuclear plants in this area, a coal plant, several gas-fired plants, as well as a hydro plant or 2. The red plus signs, as you might guess, are large hospitals, and the blue water droplets are raw water intake, raw water treatment, and wastewater treatment facilities. These are what we would consider to be the most key parts of the infrastructure. Also, you see there's a little airplane. That's Charlotte Airport, as well as the Air National Guard facility. That's a shared facility there. We also consider that to be a key part of critical infrastructure. But even this already a lot of assets here just in this one subset. It'd be quite a bit to go through in this oral presentation, so we're going to zoom in another step and show you York County. If you go back, actually, you can see this is at the southwest or bottom left of the screen, and we're going to zoom in on just that one county. We have a lot of connections in York County. Many of them are actually here today. We chose this as sort of our case study because we can cross-reference with these people we have on the ground. I was actually able to visit about a month ago, and we have a little bit of a more first-hand knowledge area, so that's a good place to get started before you abstract everything into a database. In York County, you see you have a hydroelectric generator and a nuclear power plant, 1 large hospital that services most of the county, as well as several pieces of water treatment and water intake facilities. Now we can overlay this map of critical infrastructure and generation assets with GIS data on electrical transmission and substation assets. So this is the same, and again, I'll switch between the two so you can see. This is the same map. One is just an electrical nodal map. The black dots are substations, and the bluish lines are large transmission lines. And we can use these 2 sets of data to piece out which lines and which substations are most important for connecting things such as the hydroelectric plant to the nuclear plant to ensure it has sufficient cooling and the ability to restart, and then the ability to get power from the nuclear plant out to key sources of load. What you see here is this is the hydroelectric plant and the nuclear plant. This is just some of the data that we're going to use to characterize those and estimate the cost. We determined we need both of those to facilitate critical infrastructure. Then here are the transmission substations, and I've highlighted the ones that we were able to back out as most important for ensuring that these key pieces of critical infrastructure remain online. And this is a key part of estimating the cost, is that not all assets have to be protected. And understanding which assets need to be protected to this higher standard and which ones don't are necessary for ensuring this is a prudent use of taxpayer money, and that this is an affordable proposition. So the highlighted ones, you see about half of them seem to be necessary for ensuring critical infrastructure remains online. So that was the first step, identifying these key links in the chain. You also will notice I skipped over controls and communication for right now. Again, we're at an early stage in the project, so we haven't done that step yet. But these are the main assets. The second stage we have is estimating the unit cost for each of these, and I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly because, again, we're at an early stage here. So this is essentially how we're gonna do this. Generators, we're looking at taking the capital costs of the electrical controls and applying some type of fraction. Again, this is going to be based off of, well, hopefully we'll do better, but right now we're basing this off of just rules of thumb. As I mentioned, we got from expert consultation, about 25% of the electrical cost will be needed to harden existing infrastructure, about 5% for new build. Control rooms, there are vendors that will do this, so we're using vendor quotes. Most of them base the cost on floor space, is essentially the multiplier, saying we can harden a control room for this amount of money per square foot. And then substations, we have a breakdown here. We've gone through and estimated the unit cost of each of the components of substation protection there. You come out to about $500,000 per transformer. The next step is you multiply each of these by your unit cost and you get the aggregate cost. Now, I put this together a little bit ahead of time for the sake of this presentation. So these are preliminary numbers. We hope to do a little bit better, but this is what it might look like for York County. Again, the main costs are going to be the generators and these transmission assets. What you come to, I'll just skip to this bottom line, is about $200 million for the county. Now, a lot of those assets will also have benefit to surrounding areas. But what you also see is that the majority of this cost is the hardening cost of the nuclear plant, the Catawba nuclear plant. This is kind of tricky. Most of the knowledge we actually have, I would say, is on the cost of hardening control systems, control rooms, hardening communications, hardening substations. We have a lot less reliable data on what it costs to actually harden the generators, frankly, because no one's actually done it. But we know that that's going to be the main cost driver. So that's a bit of a conundrum we have, and that what we know our greatest cost is also our most uncertain. So in summary, again, I think it's important to point out that $172 estimate per person per year is going to be a high estimate. We don't have to protect all infrastructure to ensure critical, you don't have to protect all electric grid assets to ensure critical infrastructure remains functioning at a minimum level. Secondly, we know generator hardening will be the majority of costs, but there's large error bars around that right now. And a big part of the work we'll be doing will be hopefully reducing those error bars. And finally, we hope that by presenting and sharing this power system database that we put out and having a transparent methodology and being active in presenting this, people can call us out if they think we're doing something wrong. I'm a young guy. I have some experience in this field, but I know a lot of people in this room probably have a lot more specialized knowledge that we don't have. And if we're doing something wrong, if we have a high estimate somewhere, if we're leaving something out, please let us know. That's the whole point of us being transparent. We're going to put this out in a iterative fashion, and we hope that we can make continual improvements to really get to if not a consensus, at least an open and transparent starting point for a discussion of a cost estimate. And really having a basis of a sound cost estimate is the beginning of a public policy debate. Right now, the Congress can't really take up this issue if there's no idea what this is going to cost. There's no way to begin a real debate on costs and benefits without this key piece of data. So that's our hope in pursuing this project. We hope that you all will be involved and help share your expertise. So thank you for your time. And if there's any time, I can take any questions maybe?
I think they'll have to ask you.
Offline? All right, that's fine. Thanks, Mary. Thank you.